Hello again. In these strange times we are all living through, when some of us have, in words that were once used to describe rich women's lives in the 19th and early 20th centuries, nothing or little to do all day and all day to do it in, I thought you might like to fill in about 3/4 of an hour listening to another fireside chat. I'm Dr. Viv Newman and I write for Pen and Sword, the most prolific publisher of military and social military history in the UK. Whichever war you might be interested in, they are sure to have a number of books about it. One area of interest of mine, which led to a book being published in 2019, is children in the First World War. All historians of childhood agree that there is a fundamental dilemma. Childhood is not really fixed. When does it end? Before 1918, the official school leaving age, which was frequently more disrespected than respected, was around 13. With some children being taken out of school long before this. Yet, school leavers who entered employment in factories, farms, and as domestic servants did not earn an adult wage. But if 13 was far too young, 21, the age at which a young person was no longer a minor, was far too old for a book about children. So I finally decided to include youngsters aged under 18, the official age at which a man could enlist in the British Army and a woman work in the danger sheds of the munitions factories. Whilst this excluded the 18-year-old 10-day married French war widow, who in 1918 was prohibited from returning to her girls' school in Lyon, but instead, bizarrely, offered a place at a boys' school, it included amongst many other interesting children, Newfoundland Tommy Ricketts, the youngest living VC in George V's army. So, without further ado, and setting the age range from 0 to 17, let's now turn to those who were young in World War I. In his foreword to Nina MacDonald's jingoistic wartime nursery rhymes, reviewer George Sims rightly noted, the tragic note of war has been brought into the nurseries and playrooms of the rising generation. A cursory glance through this book, toy seller, toy manufacturers and children's books catalogues demonstrates the truth of his comment. By 1914, toys had become big business. All but the very poorest children would have possessed a few. Girls may have owned a rag doll, its china face often made in Germany, whilst most boys and a number of girls had some painted tin soldiers, which proved a popular wartime gift for English children. Henry Harris, who as an adult became an acknowledged expert on tin soldiers, received his first box when his officer father returned from France in 1916. 2 years later, the now tin soldier-obsessed Henry owned over 400 figures, subsequently losing a number in a war game in 1914, which proves that gambling never really pays. German children were equally enthusiastic collectors. A young German girl from Schneidemühl, deep in eastern Germany, named Peter Kur, had an impressive collection. However, her soldiers suffered a more dramatic end than Henry's. In March 1915, German school children were instructed to bring in tin, lead, zinc, brass and old iron for the war effort. Pete writes, "Out of this are to be made gun barrels, cannons, cartridge cases and so forth. There is keen competition between the classes. So, with heavy heart, my little army with which my brother and I had so often played had to meet their deaths. To avoid all the soldiers being sacrificed, I drew lots for the candidates for death. I placed the unlucky ones 2 by 2 in a large metal spoon and held it over the gas flame. The heroes in their lovely blue uniforms melted to death for the fatherland." While Pete's sacrificing of her soldiers arguably served some purpose, British children were also encouraged to sacrifice their toys. Germany was, of course, the pre-war mecca of the toy industry, and now some British children discovered, to their surprise, that a favourite toy had become an enemy. Elizabeth Owen remembered into old age how the day war was declared, I was 7, and I was playing in the garden when I was asked to go and speak to my grandmother. To Elizabeth's distress, her favourite toy, a German-made camel, was confiscated. Young Ivy Keane, seemingly more patriotic than Elizabeth, rejected her lovely china-faced doll, when learning from her brothers of its German origins. Ivy promptly divested it of all its clothes and hung it upside down in the gooseberry bush, where it languished for many a month. Miniature soldiers appeared in wartime picture books destined for the youngest children. Charlotte Chalet-Mouilleau's L'histoire d'un brave petit soldat, the story of a brave little soldier, opens in a toy cupboard. Immediately war is declared, the nameless brave little soldier, thereby representing all brave French soldiers, rushes to enlist, cheered on by all the other toys depicting allied nations, but not, of course, Central Power ones. He heroically defends France, shoots down planes, holds back the enemy, decorated for bravery. He is imprisoned, he cunningly escapes, he is seriously wounded, he is miraculously brought back to life by 6 Red Cross nurse dolls, and is conveniently fit enough to join in the toy cupboard's victory celebrations, even though when the book was published, the war had another 3 years to run. Bellicose picture books with fictional children demonstrating patriotic behaviour were not restricted to French authors. Tapping into a well-established pre-war tradition, many ABC books were available for the very young. The garishly illustrated 1914 The Child's ABC of the War told young readers, E, that's for England, true to her trust, peaceful, but ready to fight when she must. Not wishing to be outdone, the senior services, the Royal Navy and ABC for Little Britons reminded readers that B is Britannia, the land of the free, and, thanks to our battleships, Queen of the Sea. Although the child dressed in sailor uniform on the last page is only 7, he intends to sail on the Iron Duke with Jellicoe, where I'll do my best to fire the guns and sink the warships of the Huns. Whether fought by toy soldiers or 7-year-olds, the war was graphically present on pre-readers' bookshelves and in their toy cupboards. German-speaking children were unsurprisingly equally well catered for. Taking its name from the popular soldiers' song Lieb Vaterland magst ruhig sein, Dear Fatherland, Don't Worry, a small band of German and Austrian boys played peacefully in their garden until Serbia, his big brother Russia, aided by dastardly French, Belgian, English and Japanese boys, cruelly attacked them. Battle is joined, but the little gardeners are victorious. Having imprisoned their enemies, they peacefully continue gardening. However fictionalized its portrayal, children who were too young to read for themselves could still be reminded of a war in which many of their fathers and older kin were fighting, and which they were told was being fought to make the world safer for them. War toys also abounded. Parents, wanting to keep their sons fit for the army, invested in the popular Punch the Kaiser dummy, which claimed it would keep boys strong and muscular. During Christmas 1914, British families could sink German submarines whilst playing Kill Kiel. The most adventurous could find their way to Constantinople, while others could dash to Berlin. Priced at 1 shilling trade, around £5.50 today, this new and breathless game for winter evenings promised all the excitement, but, reassuringly, none of the danger. Players representing Great Britain, France, Belgium and Russia rolled the dice to move along the grid, the winner being the first one to reach square 90, Berlin. In Recruiting for Kitchener's Army, players rose from private to field marshal, depending on the number of recruits they enlisted. Traditional snakes and ladders, or the French equivalent jeu de loi, lent itself easily to Central Power snakes baddies and allied ladders goodies. Games such as Peace with Honour, with its goal of reaching a sensible détente and conscientious objector dolls, were rare exceptions to the jingoistic theme. Not all games were board ones. 1915's most gruesome offering was The Exploding Trench. A 30-centimetre long wood and cardboard muddy green coloured trench contained half a dozen miniature soldiers. When the Union flag was struck, the soldiers were catapulted into the air in all directions as if by an explosion. Despite the box claiming that the game was very interesting with no danger, It was deemed to have crossed the thin line dividing acceptable and non-acceptable toys, and its life was short-lived. So much so that a rare example was snapped up at auction in the US in 2013 for $7,200. Perhaps bit parts of soldiers flying around the room was too graphic a reminder of the fate that might await young players' male kin. From the outset, children revelled at playing war. In August 1914, 6-year-old Simone de Beauvoir invented what she later termed games appropriate to the circumstances. As yet, showing no signs of her ardent feminism, I was Poincaré, my girl cousin, George V, my sister Hélène, the Tsar. We held conferences and we set about the Prussians. In Germany, in December 1914, 12-year-old Pete and friends refused to be beaten by the weather. Despite it being so cold that we can hardly play soldiers in the yard, the ever-pragmatic Pete arranged to have a drill session to harden us. After all, our troops at the front suffer much greater cold. In Turkey, playing war games was even state-sanctioned, with the official aim of raising orphan boys in the most profitable way, both intellectually and physically. 300 rifles were sent to an Istanbul orphanage. These proved so successful in instilling order and nationalist feeling that the War Ministry dispatched a further 1,000 across Turkey. Enemy flags, uniforms and military equipment captured at Gallipoli further enhanced orphan boys' nationalistic pride. The boys, many of whom were soldiers' orphans, were instructed to play war using these genuine items, thereby instilling nationalistic and militaristic feelings with reference to both their father's martyrdom and their fatherland's victory. These young Turkish boys were not alone in using genuine props, and those brought home by serving relatives were deeply prized. English children, of course, loved the German Pickelhaube, whilst Pietke's Uncle Bruno believed that his October 1916 gift of his old army boots and an enemy soldier's steel helmet would enhance her war games and her frequently low status amongst school friends. The reality proved very different. When I looked more closely inside the helmet, I saw that on the edge of the neck there was a name scratched with a sharp object. This man is no longer alive. I am holding his helmet in my hand. Me, a German girl, one of those who killed him. Deeply disturbed by this bringing of war into the home, by January 1917, the helmet and boots have become increasingly significant to this sensitive German adolescent. Why has fortune sent me the soldier's helmet and Uncle Bruno's army boots? There must be some meaning in it. I have actually told Uncle Bruno that one day I would invent a dance that portrays a soldier rising from a mass grave, or something like that. On the 8th of November 1918, Pete's now serving brother arrived home in his torn uniform. She knew this would complete the dance costume. Steel helmet, army boots, battle dress. I had to have it at all costs before he surrendered it to some idiotic quartermaster. Having fought and bitterly won the uniform, I held it pressed against me with both arms, sobbing bitterly. The poor, poor German field uniform. With her war games relegated to her former existence, 16-year-old Pete, now a committed pacifist, choreographed her dance, Spectre of War. Subsequently performed on the professional stage, this dance would eventually lead her to staring death in the face and fleeing Nazi Germany with only the clothes she stood up in. Although children played war games and pretended to be soldiers, for many children, the soldiers of whom they saw the most were prisoners of war, and these feature in several of the diaries that I used extensively in my research. Some children initially saw POWs as bogeymen, but they came to accept them as part of the wartime landscape, with friendships growing up between children who were missing their fathers and soldiers who were missing their youngsters. Young Henri Dillot felt that the POWs who worked in his village in northern France, including for his carpenter grandfather, were to be pitied. He made a point of always greeting them politely. Bonjour, Boche! Some made him toys out of spare bits of wood, which, when instructed to throw them away, he simply hid and retrieved at night, and kept for the rest of his life. Such intimate contact made him, and many like him, find it hard to believe the stories that Allied children were constantly being told of Germans cutting off children's hands. French teenager Marcel Le Rouge also began to understand that German soldiers, like French ones, were human beings. Shown a cache of letters removed from dead Germans, these were scrutinized for possible military intelligence, there are hints that she realizes that much of the negative propaganda that was fed to the French public about their enemies was simply that, although children living in France and Belgium's occupied zones would have disagreed. Marcel believed that the soldiers display no enmity towards us and do not speak of victory, but of peace, which they await eagerly. One soldier's seemingly mundane letter particularly distressed her. His poor mother will never know that he died suffering from a head cold. She sees the irony of letters destined for loved ones in Germany remaining in France, and she wonders if the reverse happens to letters from dead or captured French soldiers. In October 1914, Pete discovered a camp and a cemetery holding predominantly Russian POWs on the outskirts of Schneidermühl. She and her dear friend Gretel visit the little Russian cemetery to rake it and clear the graves of weeds. Having completed their task, Pete prayed, "Dear God, take these dead enemies into your care, forever and ever. Amen." On numerous occasions, sometimes accompanied by Gretel, sometimes alone, Pete visited both the camp and the cemetery. On the 19th of March 1917, now like the majority of German children suffering from severe malnutrition, she muses, just what do the 45,000 prisoners in the Russian camps eat? That's what I'd like to know. Gretel and I still go past the camp, and we put a few eatables through the fence when the guards are looking the other way. I think they look the other way on purpose. Whilst these children empathised with enemy prisoners, in brutally occupied Sedan, two children, who along with Pete were amongst my most valuable primary sources, record living with the enemy. Yves Congar and Germaine Paruy both record in the diaries they kept throughout the war a deeply distressing episode which occurred on the 2nd of January 1917, the arrival of Romanian prisoners. Yves, with a maturity beyond his 13 years, comments how today these living corpses that were once soldiers arrived at Sedan. In images that still have the power to shock, both youthful diarists graphically describe the starving, bleeding Romanians stumbling under the blows their captors rained down on them. As the horrified Sedanais watched this parade of pitiful humanity, they endeavoured to give what little food they had. Germaine notes the animal-like sounds emitting from the prisoners' throats. She understands how this incident has shaken Sedanais, whose husbands, sons, loved ones were themselves held as prisoners of war in Germany. Might they be being treated in similar fashion? Both children are proud of the Sedanais who tried to share what little food they had with the prisoners. "We will be hungry tonight," wrote Germaine, whilst Yves detailed the fines imposed on those who were caught throwing food, not to mention the baker, who in an act of both courage and defiance, the next day refused to sell bread to the Germans. Sedan was fined 50,000 marks for its humanitarian actions, leading to increased suffering amongst its already suffering population, which both children describe in great detail. By October 1918, Belgians were also close to starving, and, as in Sedan, a number of children were kept alive by feeding programs, which included giving them a brioche which consisted of their lunch. Little Yvonne Vizelet in Monceau-sur-Sambre was amongst the beneficiaries. On the 12th of October 1918, she and her school friends heard that a group of French prisoners of war would be briefly held in Monceau, surrounded by armed guards. Distraught at their pitiful state, and heedless of the commands barked out by the German guards that all contact with prisoners was verboten, Yvonne rushed forward and handed her precious bun to a prisoner. To the horror of bystanders, prisoners, and indeed a number of the soldiers, a shot rang out, and 8-year-old Yvonne crumpled at her mother's feet. She died 24 hours later, her humanitarian actions leading to her posthumously becoming the youngest recipient of the Médaille de la Reconnaissance Française, the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, and the Cross of the Order of Leopold. A memorial was erected to her in Charleroi, as well as a street named after her, which has recently been renamed in honour of a boxer. Children were not only observers of prisoners of war. Elizabeth Trucker, born in 1904, lived with her younger sister and widowed schoolmaster father in Popoen, close to the German-Russian border. On the 28th of August 1914, Elizabeth writes how a cyclist shouted the words that the town had long dreaded: "The Russians are coming!" "We tore across the fields trying to hide. While we were doing this, the Russians surrounded the cyclist who had given the warning and started beating him up. We will never forget the sight. The entire district was burning day and night." On the 14th of September 1914, along with many others, Elizabeth's family were arrested. Armed soldiers escorted us to the station. Spending 20 days in a cattle truck, heading to an unknown destination, the journey acquired a nightmare quality. Food was almost non-existent, but lice, the soldiers' constant companion, soon proliferated. As the train ploughed ever further east, Elizabeth notes how the word "where" was going round and round in everyone's head. With the guards having stolen most of their possessions, the deportees arrived in Krasnoyarsk in Siberia. Perched on a barren plateau surrounded by barbed wire, this former military base became one of the largest internment camps in Russia. With disease soon sweeping through the camp, Elizabeth lists both fatalities and explained how internees found ways of adapting to life behind the barbed wire, where life shrinks to hunger, want, and death. Encouraged by her schoolmaster father, Elizabeth kept a diary throughout their captivity, and this records what can be seen as her gradual return to life. Rather, however, than any palpable Russophobia, she became intrigued by her surroundings, struck by how, with their fair hair and blue eyes, Siberians are far from the barbarians of German discourse. We have had the opportunity to enter into closer relations with them and to get to know their customs. In May 1918, the family was finally liberated under the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Initially traumatized, this child prisoner of war has come to identify with the enemy amidst whom she had lived for over 3 years. During their 2-year return journey across a Russia in turmoil, undertaken mainly in carts and troikas, she was touched by Russian generosity. If we are not frozen, we owe it to the pitiful Russian women who gave us furs and felt boots. Far from the front, these people know nothing of the hatred of war. Similarly, an elderly Russian peasant who, watching in bewilderment as the German families were repatriated, commented, "Why, the Germanskys are just like us." One could argue, with her home so close to the Russian frontier, that Elizabeth had the misfortune to live in the wrong town at the wrong time. A group of children who lived in the wrong country at the wrong time were of Ukrainian heritage. In the late 19th century, the Canadian government had sought immigrants to populate its vast territory in the West. Many of these 1.5 million individuals of multiple religious faiths and ethnic backgrounds, enticed by the government's promise of 160 acres of free land, came from Germany and the ramshackle Austro-Hungarian Empire, including Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine was not then an independent country. 80% of it was ruled by Russia, and the remaining 20% lay in the Austro-Hungarian provinces of Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia. Driven partly by loathing of their Austro-Hungarian overlords, these immigrants put down roots in Canada, raised families, and some even managed to buy their own home. Canada was their new home. After 3 years' residency, they were eligible to apply for Canadian nationality, and children born there were automatically entitled to citizenship. Immediately war was declared, the Dominion of Canada loyally threw its wholehearted support behind the mother country. As in many, probably all belligerent countries, initial distrust of citizens originating from Canada's enemies, be these real or perceived, rapidly hardened into visceral hatred. All were assumed to be potential spies and saboteurs whose nefarious activities needed controlling. On the 22nd of August 1914, the Canadian War Measures Act allowed the authorities to arrest, detain, censor, exclude, deport, control and capture all persons and property considered as potential threats to Canada. This included the 150,000 non-naturalized residents whose birth country lay within the Central Powers, which in Ukrainians' case was Austro-Hungary territories. Overnight, they became enemies. On the 28th of October 1914, the registration and even the internment of enemy nationals was authorized. Within a matter of weeks, internment camps began to spring up. Anyone thought to be an enemy sympathizer could be arrested and interned without trial. This fate befell a significant number of German nationals, including their children, and indeed, in at least one case, a British woman whose pre-war marriage had led to her losing her British and therefore unwillingly gaining German nationality. Whilst I haven't time to tell you these children's stories, let me tell you about another group, the Canadian national children born in Canada to Ukrainian parents. Very aware that an explosive situation might be building up in Canada, on the 8th of February 1915, London sent the Canadian government a list of races considered to be hostile to Austro-Hungarian rule, and thus friendly to Canada. The list included those classed as Ukrainians. Nevertheless, on the 19th of April 1915, the first group of 20 married couples and children, 92 people in all, predominantly Ukrainian Catholics, were forcibly entrained in Montreal. Their destination was the distant Spirit Lake in Quebec. They were the vanguard of the several thousand Ukrainians who would languish at the notorious camp with tar paper shacks for families. Single men were housed under military orders in wooden barracks. The perimeter of the camp was surrounded by a high wire fence with large lamps at each corner, and the gates were closed at night to prevent escapes. When the American consul, Villerig, who was overseeing Ukrainian affairs in Canada, visited Spirit Lake in November 1916, he commented on the terrible conditions, with prisoners, including children, huddled together like a herd of sheep in winter. On the 13th of January 2008, the 93rd anniversary of the opening of Spirit Lake Camp, the last known survivor of any of the internment camps, she's pictured there in her mother's arms, Mary Bayard, died. As testimony to the dark, shameful shadow internment had cast over hundreds of families, it had taken Mary many decades to confess to her son that she had seen the light of day in a concentration camp, in a tar paper shack in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by barbed wire, soldiers, rifles, and bayonets. Another victim, Mary Manco, was born in Montreal in 1909. This family's nightmare started in early 1915 when her parents, Andre and Catherine, their children, 6-year-old Mary, John, Annie, and baby Nellie, all of whom had been born in Canada, arrived at Spirit Lake. Sadly, 2-year-old Nellie died on the 22nd of May 1915. 79 years after her sister's death, Mary attempted to find her grave. I would like to go back and visit Nellie's grave one last time, but I'm told it's no longer there. Her body was moved. Why, or when, or how, I don't know. No one seems to know where she rests. Knowing where one's dead are buried and being able to visit them is a theme that runs powerfully through the story of the aftermath of the First World War, and one which I shall perhaps try and talk about in another of these fireside chats. Quebec novelist J. Ulrich Dumont's Le Pays du Domaine epitomizes the internment program, its sinister shadows echoing cries of women and its overwhelming sense of melancholy, serving as a reminder of all the restless souls who were interned and kept at gunpoint during this black period. However, in attempts to come to terms with the past, the Ukrainian-Canadian Restitution Act received royal assent on the 28th of November 2005, thereby acknowledging that this unlawful internment of innocent men, women and children had indeed happened. As we historians are so keen to point out, and yet still shake our heads in despair at how rarely this happens, it is only by acknowledging and addressing the past that we can hope to learn from and avoid similar mistakes in the future. Mary Manco's simple words of warning are powerful. Because no one bothered to remember or learn about the wrong that was done to us, it was done to others again and yet again. Maybe there's an even greater wrong in that. So let's now move on to two young people who actually went off to the war. Désiré Bianco saw the light of day near Marseille on the 4th of April 1902. Little is known about his early childhood other than he had a very wayward streak, which his impoverished parents struggled unsuccessfully to control. On the 6th of August 1914, to Désiré and his classmates' excitement, in full uniform and with flowers in their rifles, the 6th Hussars marched past their classroom to entrain at Marseille's St. Charles station. 12-year-old Désiré now had one obsession: to accompany the soldiers to the front. In January 1915, Désiré made the first of 3 attempts to fulfill his dream. On the first 2 occasions, although he got close, he was rapidly returned with a flea in his ear to parental control, or lack of it. Still determined to, in his words, see the war, or at least more of it than he had already seen, having twice got close to the fighting around Alsace, the obstinate lad now tried his luck on a troop ship departing from Toulon. With his 13th birthday just behind him, on the 2nd of May 1915, young Désiré hid aboard La France, which was carrying men of the 58th Régiment d'Infanterie Coloniale to Cape Helles and the killing fields of the Dardanelles. One can only imagine his glee when the ship reached the open sea. A few hours later, the young stowaway was discovered. As the ship certainly could not be turned around to offload one young fugitive, there was nothing for it, as far as the regiment was concerned, but to keep him with them, ideally out of harm's way. To Désiré's delight, he was kitted out with a rifle and a sailor's uniform, and he was designated regimental mascot. On the 6th of May, the regiment disembarked at Sed El Bahir. Just as some of his near-contemporary midshipmen serving with the Royal Navy are reported to have done, Désiré grinned in excitement as shells burst around him. Having taken up their positions in the trenches and with barely time to draw breath, on the 8th of May, the men of the 58th were ordered to attack and, irrespective of losses, take a small fort perched on Hill 300 to the east of the small town of Krivia. Désiré was ordered to remain in the battalion's trench. Perhaps by way of consolation, and astutely realizing the youngster needed something more military to do than twiddle his thumbs, or, as the French put it, watch the soup, a Lieutenant Asquier instructed Désiré to keep his sword safe. At precisely 1300 hours, the men leapt out of the trench. Then, to his horror, out of the corner of his eye, Asquier glimpsed a small figure brandishing his sword and shouting, "Forward with bayonets, men!" Désiré's fate was now beyond anyone's control. Sometime before 1500 hours, when the first line of the battalion reached the Turkish trenches, little Désirée was seen to totter and fall. Like the battalion commander, Lieutenant Asquier, 16 other officers, 54 NCOs, and 842 men, Mascotte Bianco had survived barely 48 hours after disembarking from La France. His body, like those of so many others, was never found. By the 10th of December 1915, the 58th Régiment d'Infanterie Coloniale had been bled white. Back in France, with a disastrous campaign behind them and further bloodbaths still to come, men of what was left of the 58th clamoured for recognition for their gallant, if thoroughly stubborn, little companion. On the 30th of August 1916, he was, with General Joffre's approval, cited in General Orders 54 of the day for the Armée de l'Orient. This special citation to the young Mascotte, who died with the sword his officer had entrusted to him in his hand, heads the lists of honours and awards conferred on the officers and men of the regiment for their gallant, often overlooked actions in the Dardanelles. Largely forgotten during the war years, in time, Désirée's enthusiasm and courage came to be constructed as more important than his obstinacy or disobedience. On the 28th of August 1920, it was recognised that, killed by the enemy, he had died for France, which entitled his parents to a pension. On the 17th of May 1936, 21 years and 9 days after his death, watched by his parents, the Kid from Marseille was posthumously decorated with a military medal and the Croix de Guerre, and a monument was unveiled in front of Toulon's Grignon barracks. Only the churlish would suggest that the solemn face sculpture bears little resemblance to the mischievous, obstinate, disobedient lad, whose story, as the local newspaper Var Matin pointed out on the 11th of November 2013, owes much to the futile, to the comic, to the tragic. Another teenage fighter who has aroused little interest amongst Anglophone historians is Sofia Lipowicz, who was born in Poland in August 1914. She was born in Poland, and in August 1914, an independent Poland as we know it today did not exist, partitioned instead in the late 18th century between Austro-Hungary, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire. Like so many of her contemporaries, Sofia had listened to tales of long-dead Polish freedom fighters, and in particular female revolutionaries. She writes, "It became my indomitable desire to follow in the footsteps of these great women and show the boys that it is not their exclusive privilege to fight for the freedom of their country." She would translate her defiant words into actions. When war was declared, the teenage tomboy made several abortive attempts to run away and join the motley Polish freedom fighters, which were springing up. Intercepted on each occasion, she was returned to her family to help care for her mother and 5 younger sisters. Between the winter of 1914 and 1916, Cossacks ransacked Sofia's home. Her village changed hands several times between the Russians and Germans. At considerable personal risk, she began serving the Polish military organization as a courier, smuggling letters, money, and firearms. Finally, successfully, running away and enlisting in a volunteer Polish defense force. Having joined the fighting ranks and claiming she knew how to shoot, the sergeant watched her carefully. Unimpressed, he spat and addressed her as girl citizen. Having been given a Polish national cap, under which I hid my long braids, folded so tightly round my head that it began to ache, I got rid of my skirt at the first possible moment. Drilling and being taught how to handle a rifle, Sofia became worried when none of the officers looked at me wonderingly, and I, being afraid he would realise that I was a girl, pushed my cap deeper over my ears. Action was needed, so I went outside, where another soldier, without any ceremony or talent, cut off my long hair, which, when spread out, covered my uniform like an overcoat. By November 1918, she was caught up in the Battle of Lemberg or Lvov, then part of eastern Galicia, now part of Western Ukraine. Soon, in the thick of the fighting, and taking to heart their officers' advice that despite being ill-equipped, the young freedom fighters should throw themselves into the fray, I forgot I was a woman. I knew only that I had to fight hard to avenge the Polish losses. Wounded, I did not feel the pain, though blood was pouring from my hands and forehead. The battle for Lvov was bloody and hard won. Children in their early teens, many of whom were killed, became known as Lvov eaglets. Polish artist Wojciech Kosak's painting of the eaglets is a visual testimony to the fighters' youth. The painting is sanitized, the children clean and well clothed. More realistically, Sofia acknowledges, we were soiled with mud, blackened with smoke. I am sure that my mother would not have recognized me now. If for Sofia the war had not yet ended, the Battle of Lvov lasted until May 1919, and she saw it through to the bitter end. For many of the children you have met during the course of this chat, and the many others I have not had time to tell you about, November 1918 heralded a time of ambiguity. Despite the celebrations, at least for the Allies, many children had to accept that beloved family members would never return. Others, that the undoubted excitement of the war was over and life would return to a normality that many could not even remember, but soon proved boring. French children who had spent the war under the heel of a brutal occupier discovered, as young Yves Congar had presciently foretold in his diary, that the rest of France was disinterested in their fate, even accusing them of having been collaborators and deeming them, insultingly, les Boches du Nord. The children who had been presented with jingoistic storybooks, board games and uniforms, the diarists who, like Yves Congar and Germaine Parouy, had seen at first hand man's inhumanity to man. Those who had experienced the war inside internment camps, and those who had run away to war would, if they had looked back, have barely recognized their pre-war selves. One who would certainly not have done so, and who had arguably made the greatest emotional journey, is Pete Cure, who had so willingly sacrificed her tin soldiers for Germany's war effort. In late November 1918, clutching a homemade wreath, near skeletal from lack of food, wearing shoes made of cardboard, shivering in old thin coats, 16-year-old Pete, accompanied by her ever-faithful friend Gretel, trudged through deep snow to the cemetery adjoining the prisoner of war camp they had so frequently visited. Here, the two adolescent girls paid homage to all who had suffered in the war. We placed our green fir wreath on an unknown Frenchman's grave, with him representing all whom the war had destroyed. Pete assured him, and by extension all who had lost their lives, irrespective of the flag under which they had fought, my thoughts are with you, and my tears every day. Thank you for listening.